Welcome back. This lecture is going to be on really the second half of the unit on alfalfa, and this will encompass alfalfa establishment and management. First, let's talk about establishing alfalfa. In order to do a good job or have a long-lived stand of alfalfa, we've got to choose an appropriate site. And if you'll remember back to the last lecture, we said alfalfa does not like wet soils or wet conditions, so we need to pick a deep, well-drained, and fertile soil for the alfalfa. The seeding rate for alfalfa is 15 to 20 pounds per acre at about 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep and no deeper. We can seed in the spring and in the fall, but most prefer the springtime because it reduces the risk of sclerotinia, crown and root rots. Fall seedings can work, and they work better when we seed as early as possible. That helps them survive the winter, and it also helps the plant get up large enough that it can begin to develop some of its natural resistance to sclerotinia, stem and crown rot. The seeding methods for alfalfa vary quite a bit. From prepared seed bed with a cultipacker giving good results. No-till seedings can be successful if we're very good at controlling other vegetation and placing the seed at the right depth. Frost seedings, on the other hand, do not work and are not recommended. So let's take a look at the kind of seeders, or at least what is a cultipacking seeder. You can see that the cultipacking seeder has a mechanism to hold the seed and to meter it out. It drops it onto the soil surface, and where it is then run over or compressed with corrugated rollers like this Brilliant seeder. And you can tell that it leaves the seed bed, which in this case is a very fine, firm seed bed, with a very with a corrugated appearance. And the seeds are going to come up basically almost entirely down in these grooves or these lower areas. This is another view of an older cultipacker seeder up on top, and a seed bed that's going to be a little bit harder to work with. This is a much more a silty loam, or maybe even a silty or a sandy loam down here at the bottom. This is going to have a good bit more clay in it, and you can see the clods and the coarser texture of this seed bed. This happens to be in Hardin County, and this is in Owen County in northern Kentucky. A little bit about seed cost, and over the course of this semester, we have talked a lot about seed cost because I think it's important to have an idea about how much investment you're asking a producer to make when you recommend a given crop. And I have placed at the top here 3 different prices for 3 different varieties straight off the internet. And let's take a look at those. On the left is Bulldog 805 alfalfa. 805 is most likely an 8 fall dormancy, something for Georgia, and it's developed and selected for down in the South, and hence the name Bulldog. And it's about $271 for a 50-pound bag, or just over $5 a pound. From that same source, you can get Alpha Gray's 600 alfalfa seed, which is Roundup ready. 50 pounds, you can tell it costs more than $10 a pound, at $569 for that same 50-pound bag. So now this is going to be a traditional hay or gray hay type without the Roundup Ready trait. The Roundup Ready trait comes with a premium cost. And on the other end of the price spectrum is a variety, in this case like Vernal alfalfa seed, a 50-pound bag which costs $100 from Rural King. I checked with the vendor in Cynthiana for their alfalfa prices, and their economical variety, comparable to Vernal, is Buffalo at $3.25 a pound. Their best buy is Triple Trust 500 at $4.55 a pound, comparable to the Bulldog 805 and a little cheaper. And their Roundup Ready alfalfa was $8.50 a pound, quite a bit cheaper than the Alpha Gray 600. The Alpha Gray 600 has the added advantage of the Alpha Gray's premium genetics, which is a variety or genetics selected under grazing pressure. They do stock some brands, and they have a brand at this vendor in Cynthiana called Haymaker, which is a combination of 4-Grazer 5 and L44-7 HD. And that cost is about $4.27 a pound. Only a small discount from the Triple Trust 500, which they listed as their best buy, and I would agree. Let's talk about the special case of alfalfa autotoxicity. This is where plants of alfalfa produce compounds that inhibit the germination and vigor of new alfalfa plants, self-allelopathy, if you want to name it that way or call it or use that term. It's relevant in older alfalfa fields where a producer might want to thicken up the stand. The toxic compound is known to be water-soluble and is known to come from the tops of the plants. Alfalfa autotoxicity generally does not set up or it does not become a problem until stands are more than 1 year old. So we would recommend too that you would rotate and have at least 6 months between old alfalfa stands and replanting, hopefully with no alfalfa present at all. This gives you an idea of what happens when we plant immediately after plowing under an old stand on the left, planted 4 weeks after plowing of an old stand here, and planted a year later. While that looks like a good stand, this is, at least to my eyes, a much thicker stand of alfalfa. Let's take a look at alfalfa and soil fertility just a little bit. We've already said that alfalfa has a high fertility requirement, and particularly for pH. So liming is really important for maintaining alfalfa stands. And we want to choose a lime with a high neutralizing value and apply that 3 to 6 months before planting. I've already said that alfalfa has a high potassium requirement. The average stand removes more than 250 pounds of potassium per acre per year. Adding the potassium increases the winter hardiness and tolerances to pests. A low rate of nitrogen, 25 to 30 pounds of N per acre, may help with establishment, and it may help with rhizobium infection and inoculation. Let's talk briefly about harvesting alfalfa and the importance of carbohydrate management. Now, this is going to be true whether we're talking about alfalfa as a hay crop or a haylage crop as on the left, or as a grazing crop as on the right. Now, this is a graph that we have used extensively and we'll use probably several more times in this course. And what this is, of course, is a graphic representation of a growing alfalfa plant, and the curve above those plants is the alfalfa yield as it changes over time. This is approximately 1 month of time between cutting and this tallest or highest yielding plant. Below is the percent non-structural carbohydrates in the roots, and you can see that they are high here just until or right at cutting, and just after cutting, the percent of non-structural carbohydrates in the roots drops rather dramatically as long as while the new young plants are growing and adding leaves and trying to cover the ground. They will reach non-structural carbohydrates in the roots will reach its lowest point at about 6 to 8 inches of top growth, so somewhere in here. And at this point, once the plant above reaches 6 or 8 inches, then the carbohydrate management changes, or at least the direction of flow changes, if you want to think of it as a summary kind of thing, that now the root carbohydrates begin to build back. So at this point in time, more is coming down than is going up to the top of the plant. And the carbohydrates continue to go up until we reach about a 10th bloom or first flower. And if we're aggressively cutting at bud stage, which you can do with alfalfa, it will tolerate that, but it does it at a price, because you can see that if we cut here at the bud stage, then that's where the carbohydrate level starts in order to fuel the regrowth that comes next. And you can tell that consistently cutting at the bud stage is going to not ever let that carbohydrate level get back up to the top level here. So, alfalfa regrowth is 100% dependent on stored carbs. It decreases until the plant gets to be about 6 to 8 inches tall. It returns to pre-cut level by early bloom, and this happens on about a 30 to a 35-day schedule. We say cut at 2 inches, and actually it's more about how tall you want to cut it for the grass that you're growing with, but cutting it about 2 inches is fine. A red clover plant has a similar cycle. Now I will say that we are cutting below 2 inches tends to stir up more dirt, and you can wind up with more dirt inside the bale and the dustier bale. So you can, and below about 3 or 4 inches, all that is down there for alfalfa plants is stem. So if we're raising alfalfa with orchard grass, as I say that we do primarily, we're going to need to raise that height for the companion grass when it's orchard grass up to about 4 inches in order to have the orchard grass persist. So if you're harvesting alfalfa for hay, harvest should occur based on the growth stage, bud stage for the first growth and a 10th bloom for regrowth, or I like to use a little different shorthand. I like to say bud the first flower for all the cuttings. And I use that because the cutting stage, while you can specify it as precisely as 1/10 bloom for a cutting, in point of fact, most of the time we're trying to gauge when we cut hay based, yes, on the plant stage of the alfalfa, but also on the weather. So if we hit it somewhere between bud and first flower and we get a good weather pattern, then that's the time that alfalfa should be cut. It's a compromise between the perfect growth stage maybe and the weather, but alfalfa haymaking is a compromise. There it is, or simply bud the first flower. We also recommend to not harvest within that 4-week period before the average first frost date. And if that's November 1, that means we really wouldn't like to rest the alfalfa stand from October 1 to November 1. And sometimes we even back that up to September 15th just to give us some insurance. So there you go. Last harvest, September 15th to October 1. As we harvest alfalfa, we try to avoid leaf shatter and loss by baling at the correct moisture, not letting it get excessively dry. And if we're going to ted, which is to use a spreading machine to fluff up the windrows or the hay in the field, we want to do that at higher moistures or early in the morning so that the plants are not as brittle and we do not lose as many leaves. Anything we can do to shorten the drying time is going to be helpful. Mower conditioner that will crush stems is helpful. Swath manipulation, not swatch. Swath manipulation is going to be good, like tedding. And making baleage is helpful, where we only need about a day between cutting and baling. So this is a photograph of alfalfa in the bud stage of growth, and you can tell a little bit. There's a bud, the bud's here. You can begin to see some structures here that will become flowers. So this is just about ready to start flowering. This is the way that a conditioner affects alfalfa stems. This is this is one with intermeshing rollers so that it crimps or crushes the stems. We do have mower conditioners that have impellers, which are rotating steel or iron bars that will scrape the stems of alfalfa and cause it to dry faster. They're a little bit more aggressive, or quite a bit more aggressive, than the intermeshing rollers. And for the most part, we don't really like to use them for alfalfa because they will knock off more leaf tissue. So let's finish up by talking about grazing alfalfa briefly. And the thing to remember about grazing alfalfa is that there is the dynamic of when we harvest, thinking about the carbohydrate management curve, but also the dynamic of will the soil support the grazing animal, and by that I mean, is it dry enough to support the grazing animal? So even though we usually think of it as a hay crop only, the grazing of alfalfa has increased in popularity, not in small part because of the work that was done by the University of Georgia and Dr. Ray Smith to help develop and prove that alpha graze was tolerant of abusive grazing, in fact. So we do have those grazing tolerant varieties that were based off of alpha graze. It was the first one. And they are known to have more crown buds and to have low-set crowns. But we still need to have some form of rotational grazing for alfalfa to yield well and persist. And again, we do not need to graze 4 to 6 weeks before frost. Now, bloat is a concern, as is treading or poking up or pugging the field when it's excessively wet. This just gives you an example of the just the strength of the grazing tolerance that are in varieties that are developed for grazing tolerance. These are pictures taken back in the 1990s, but this is a grazing susceptible variety or just a regular hay type. And this is a grazing tolerant variety on the right under abusive continuous grazing, heavy grazing by cattle, and you can tell the difference. So, in summary, alfalfa, Medicago sativa, is the highest yielding, highest quality forage in Kentucky, and it responds to management. Thank you very much. Until next time.